The night was thick, almost alive on the island of Guadalcanal. Humidity clung to every leaf. The air tasted of rotting vegetation and the metallic scent of rain waiting to fall. In the early hours of August 21, 1942, just past 3 a.m., a strange stillness settled across the darkened ridgeline east of Henderson Airfield. Even the insects, those endless, buzzing heralds of the jungle, fell silent. And then came the sound. Not the thunder of artillery. Not the growl of tank engines. But the soft, subtle rustling of movement, deliberate, synchronized, almost predatory. To the Japanese soldiers of the Ichiki detachment, lying in wet grass and slick mud, this sound should have meant opportunity. For months they had been told the same thing. The Americans were soft, unprepared, weak in the jungle. They would crumble under pressure. They would retreat at the sight of Japanese steel. They lacked the discipline, the spirit, the will to fight in a place where the natural world itself seemed determined to swallow men whole. Every briefing, every officer's assessment, every snippet of propaganda repeated the same confident refrain. In the jungle, the Japanese soldier is unmatched. But what happened on Guadalcanal would expose a truth far stranger, and far more terrifying, than anything they imagined. This is the contradiction at the heart of the story. The Japanese army believed they owned the jungle. Yet here, on Guadalcanal, the jungle turned against them, because America learned to use it too. The place intended to be their greatest advantage became their darkest nightmare. By the time dawn rose over the palm trees, streaking the canopy with thin ribbons of gold, the men of Colonel Ichiki's force were scattered across Alligator Creek, dead, wounded, or fleeing. What they faced in the night was not the disorganized, hesitant American force they expected. It was something new. Something evolving. Something they had never seen before. The Japanese would call it, the Night of the Demons. The Americans would remember it as, the moment we realized we could win. And history would mark it as the precise moment when the myth of Japanese invincibility in the jungle began to break. To understand this moment we must step back, months, years, into a world already burning. The war in the Pacific erupted with Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, followed by lightning strikes across the South Pacific. The Philippines, Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies. Island after island fell before the relentless advance of the Imperial Japanese Army, an institution hardened by a decade of brutal combat in China. By early 1942, the empire of the rising sun stretched over 7 million square miles. Its armies were seasoned. Its soldiers were disciplined. Its officers were convinced that Japanese willpower, forged through years of battlefield endurance, was unbreakable. In contrast, America was still mobilizing. Factories were converting. Boot camps were overflowing with young, inexperienced recruits. The U.S. Army and Marine Corps had fought only small-scale actions in the interwar years. In Japanese planning circles, the assessment was nearly unanimous. The Americans will not fight effectively in jungle conditions. They are too reliant on technology, too uncomfortable in primitive environments, and too inexperienced. The assumption would guide their strategy, shape their offensives, and determine their expectations at Guadalcanal. It would also become their undoing. In early 1942, almost no American had ever heard the name Guadalcanal. It was a remote island in the Solomon Chain, covered by rainforests so thick they blocked out the sun, and ringed by coral reefs that could rip the hull off a ship. But in July 1942, intelligence photos showed something alarming. The Japanese were building an airfield on the northern tip of the island, an airfield that would soon threaten supply routes between America and Australia. If it became operational, it would choke the Allied war effort before it truly began. And so, under the codename Operation Watchtower, the United States launched its first major offensive of the Pacific War. On August 7, 1942, the 1st Marine Division stormed ashore, capturing the unfinished airstrip the Japanese had spent months constructing. Within days, the Marines renamed it Henderson Field. Within weeks, it would become the most important patch of land in the South Pacific. And within months, it would become a graveyard. For the Japanese, the arrival of the Marines was a temporary inconvenience. Tokyo believed the Americans would falter quickly in the jungle, without sufficient supplies, without proper tactics, without the iron discipline required to survive. Japanese officers had spent years cultivating an image of the ideal jungle soldier. One who embraced hardship. One who ate little, marched far, and feared nothing. Their belief in American weakness was not merely propaganda, it was doctrine. This belief was reinforced by early encounters, where small Japanese patrols misinterpreted American caution for cowardice. News of these encounters traveled upward, confirming what many officers already assumed. But they did not understand what was happening on the ground. They did not understand how quickly American forces were adapting. They did not understand that the Marines, the same Marines they dismissed as amateurs, were learning the jungle. They were learning its paths, its shadows, its secrets. They were learning how to fight in it. In the coming months, this learning curve would become a weapon more devastating than any rifle or machine gun. The first major Japanese counterattack came suddenly, violently, and with total confidence. Colonel Kayaneo Ichiki, entrusted with the task of throwing the Americans off the island, landed with roughly 900 men of the elite Ichiki detachment. He believed he could annihilate the Marines in a single night. Tokyo believed him. His officers believed him. His soldiers believed him. But their belief existed in a different world, one shaped by past victories, illusions of superiority, and a profound underestimation of their enemy. What awaited them on Guadalcanal was not an army in disarray. It was an army transformed. Through necessity. Through fear. Through the unforgiving environment itself. This transformation would become the core of America's jungle tactics. Tactics born not from manuals but from survival. As Ichiki's men approached the Marine lines near Alligator Creek, they expected panic. What they found was discipline. What they expected to be a weak perimeter was a carefully structured series of interlocking fields of fire. What they believed would crumble under assault held firm under an avalanche of gunfire. What they thought were startled American recruits were Marines who had learned to fight in the dark, to listen for movement, to read the jungle like a second skin. Every Japanese advance was met by coordinated American fire. Every attempt to flank the line was halted by patrols emerging silently from the forest. Every charge was shattered against a defense far more resilient than Japanese intelligence predicted. By dawn, Ichiki's detachment was effectively destroyed. It was the first great Japanese land defeat of the war. But more importantly, it marked the end of the myth. The Americans had mastered the jungle. And the Japanese knew it. The Battle of Guadalcanal was more than a clash of nations. It was a collision of philosophies. Japanese doctrine valued offensive spirit, close combat, and night assaults. American doctrine, still forming in the early days, relied on firepower, coordination, and adaptability. The jungle became the proving ground where these two ideologies collided, twisted, and reshaped themselves. By the end, both armies would emerge scarred. But only one would emerge changed. This is the story of how, on a remote island half a world away, America learned a new form of warfare, one that weaponized the jungle itself. A story of evolving tactics, shattered assumptions, and soldiers pushed beyond anything they imagined. A story of how an army once dismissed as inexperienced transformed into a force that terrified the very soldiers who once believed themselves kings of the jungle. This is the story of Guadalcanal, and how America's jungle tactics overturned an empire's deepest convictions and reshaped the future of the Pacific War. The months before the battle on Guadalcanal were marked by a global imbalance, one in which the Imperial Japanese Army appeared unstoppable. By mid-1942, their victories stretched across the Pacific in a sweeping arc of dominance. Cities fell with terrifying speed: Singapore, Rabaul, Batavia, Manila. The world saw an empire surging forward with the confidence of a force long accustomed to victory. Within this tide of triumph, the Japanese soldier, the Heitai, had earned a near-mythic reputation. Lean, hardened, disciplined, and seemingly invulnerable to the harshest environments, he was portrayed as the master of jungle warfare. Japanese officers reinforced this belief constantly. The jungle favors the warrior who embraces it. We are the warriors of Asia. The Americans are not. But beneath the bravado lay cracks. While the Japanese army excelled in infiltration, night attacks, and endurance, they often operated on dangerously thin supply lines. Their doctrine relied on spirit, sation, over logistics. They dismissed the need for heavy equipment, reliable communications, and robust resupply. This worked when conquering unprepared garrisons. It would not work on Guadalcanal. The Americans who landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942 were hardly the polished warriors of later campaigns. Many were barely out of training camps, 19-20 years old, carrying rifles they had only recently learned to use. The 1st Marine Division had trained in the deserts of California, the scrublands of North Carolina, and the swamps of New River, but never in a true jungle. They arrived with misgivings, even fear. The heat hit them like a hammer. The mud clung to their boots. The mosquitoes swarmed in clouds. The dense jungle claustrophobia was unlike anything they had ever experienced. At first, the Marines moved cautiously along narrow trails, jumping at sounds in the underbrush, unsure of what dangers lurked beneath the canopy. Their officers warned them constantly. The Japanese own the night. The jungle is their territory. But something subtle was happening, something neither side fully understood yet. The Marines were studying the environment. They were learning its rhythms. They were watching how the Japanese moved, how they attacked, how they vanished. The jungle was brutal, yes, but it was also a teacher. And in its harsh lessons, American tactics began to evolve. The birth of American jungle tactics. Innovation under fire. The transformation began through necessity. The Japanese launched raids, sharp, sudden, lethal from the shadows, and then melted back into the trees. Patrols vanished. Snipers fired from invisible perches. The Marines quickly realized they had to change the way they fought. 1. The spread-out line. American units abandoned tight formations and created dispersed, mutually supporting positions. Every squad became a mini stronghold with overlapping arcs of fire. 2. The night fighting revolution. Marines learned to fight in darkness, listening for subtle changes in wind, scent, or movement. They trained their ears to identify. Japanese creeping signals, leaf shifts under bare feet, the low clink of bayonets, insect patterns disrupted by movement. Soon they were counter-ambushing the enemy, turning Japanese tactics back against them. 3. Firepower as a psychological weapon. The U.S. Marine Corps made a key decision. Use firepower to shape the jungle. Where Japanese doctrine prized stealth and close combat charges, American planners realized the terrain could be dominated with interlocking zones of gunfire. Machine guns, Browning .30 calibers and the heavy M1917, were positioned to sweep kill zones. Mortars were pre-sighted to fall on likely approach routes. And then there was the most terrifying weapon of all. The 37mm anti-tank gun firing canister rounds, turning the jungle into a storm of metal. One Japanese survivor said later, "It was as if the trees themselves spat fire." 4. Intelligence and patrol craft. American scouts and raider units learned the island's contours as intimately as the Japanese once had. They discovered secret paths, river crossings, and listening posts. Small units began conducting silent night patrols, once considered suicidal. When the Japanese attempted to probe American lines, they often found Marines waiting for them. 5. Stomach of the beast, logistics mastery. This was the true turning point. The Americans built an unbreakable supply chain around Henderson Field. Every night, even under bombardment, they repaired the runway. They unloaded crates in the rain. They guarded precious amounts of food, medicine, and ammunition. Meanwhile, the Japanese Tokyo Express, nighttime destroyer runs, could only deliver limited supplies. Starvation crept into the Japanese ranks long before they realized it. Desperation breeds fear. Fear breeds mistakes. And mistakes in the Guadalcanal jungle were fatal. Both sides respond. The battlefield tightens. The Japanese besiege Henderson Field. By late August, Japan committed to retaking the island. Reinforcements flooded the jungles. The 35th Infantry Brigade, the 2nd Division, and elite units under the famed General Hyakutake. Their orders were absolute. Drive the Americans into the sea. But every attack, Edson's Ridge, Matanica, the October Offensive, the Coley Point Assault, crashed into the same immovable wall. American jungle tactics were no longer improvised. They were refined and deadly. Reconstructed dialogue, Japanese officer's diary. We attacked at night believing we would surprise them. But they knew. Their guns were waiting. How do they see in the darkness? How do they hear us? They are not the same men who landed here. Marine radio chatter, Edson's Ridge. Movement on the left. Hold until they're in the wire. Machine guns locked in. They're charging. Wait, now? Gunfire erupted so loudly that Japanese soldiers later wrote they believed the Americans had demons inside their weapons. Eyewitness emotion amid mud, fear, and fire. A jungle battle is not clean or honorable. It is intimate, confusing, suffocating. Men see their enemy only for a split second, faces lit by muzzle flashes before darkness returns. Private First Class George Murphy, 1st Marines, wrote to his sister, "The jungle has its own soul. At night it whispers. But the Japanese whisper louder." Another Marine scrawled in a pocket notebook soaked with rain, "We don't fight for ground. We fight for hours, just to see another day." And from the Japanese side, a soldier's letter found on a body near Matanica. "We charge but the enemy does not break. They shoot into the trees, the dark, the river. They shoot everywhere. We cannot move. We cannot breathe." These were not mythical warriors. They were boys, frightened, hungry, exhausted, trying to carve meaning from chaos. Numbers, casualties, distances, and the psychological collapse. The cost in blood. By the end of the campaign, Japanese dead, approximately 24,000 American dead, approximately 1,600 total casualties, both sides over 33,000 aircraft lost, 100 ships sunk, more than 50. But numbers alone do not capture the devastation. By November, 60% of Japanese soldiers suffered from dysentery, malaria, or malnutrition. Thousands died without ever reaching the front lines. Some weighed less than 90 pounds. American units suffered too, but their supply system, primitive as it was, held strong. The greatest consequence was not physical. It was psychological. The Japanese began reporting a new enemy: American night ghosts. Some swore they heard Americans whispering from trees. Others believed the Marines could see in darkness. Still others insisted American firepower was supernatural. A Japanese sergeant wrote, "The jungle sides with them now. The darkness follows their orders." It was not magic. It was adaptation and relentless discipline. How Guadalcanal redefined warfare and belief. The story of Guadalcanal is not simply the story of a battle. It is the story of a transformation, one that reshaped both armies. For America, Guadalcanal taught the U.S. military how to fight in dense, unforgiving terrain, coordinate infantry, machine guns, artillery, and aircraft in a jungle environment, build resilient supply lines, master night defense, break the offensive momentum of a previously unstoppable enemy. America entered the campaign inexperienced and often unsure. It left as a modern jungle fighting machine. For Japan, Guadalcanal shattered fundamental beliefs. That spirit could overcome logistics, that the jungle favored them exclusively, that American firepower was undisciplined, that American soldiers lacked endurance. The loss on Guadalcanal forced Japanese commanders to re-evaluate their strategy. But by then the larger momentum of the war had begun shifting. Guadalcanal heralded the end of Japanese expansion and the start of America's island-hopping march across the Pacific. It was proof that adaptation, swift, painful, and relentless, can defeat even an enemy once thought invincible. The Japanese forces were not terrified because Americans were supernatural. They were terrified because Americans changed. Because the jungle itself seemed to shift allegiance. Because the myth of Japanese supremacy died on Guadalcanal's dark soil. And nothing frightens an army more than the death of its own myth. The final weeks on Guadalcanal were not marked by triumph, but by exhaustion. The jungle that had once seemed endless now felt strangely quiet. The smoke of battle hung low over the ravines. The muddy trails where men had fought and died were slowly reclaimed by vines and creeping roots. The island itself, scarred, burned, soaked with blood, exhaled a long, weary breath. By February 1943, when the last Japanese survivors were evacuated under the cover of darkness, more than 6 months had passed since the first Marines stormed ashore. 6 months of hunger, terror, rain, fever, and relentless combat. 6 months that felt like 6 years. And yet, despite the mud, despite the disease, despite the relentless pressure from sea and sky, the Americans had done what many thought impossible. They had turned the jungle into a battlefield they could master. They had broken the momentum of the Japanese Empire. They had rewritten the future of the Pacific War. Now, as we look back across the steaming ridges and riverbeds of Guadalcanal, we see not just the story of victory, but the story of transformation. When the Japanese High Command received the final reports from Guadalcanal, the shock reverberated through Tokyo. Gone were the confident assurances that American soldiers lacked the spirit to fight. Gone were the casual claims that jungle terrain favored Japanese troops alone. Instead, they were forced to grapple with a new and unsettling truth. The Americans had learned faster than anyone expected. They had adapted with a speed that defied precedent. And they had turned one of Japan's greatest advantages into a theater of humiliation. Japanese officers wrote in their journals phrases that had once been unthinkable. The enemy now uses the jungle better than we do. Their defenses are like steel in the dark. We underestimated their resolve. This was not merely a military defeat, it was an ideological one. The myth of Japanese invincibility had collapsed. The story Japan had told itself for decades, the story of spiritual supremacy over material might, was unraveling. Point 1. The American legacy, mastery of the Pacific. Guadalcanal taught American commanders lessons they carried to Cape Gloucester, Peleliu, Saipan, Tinian, Okinawa, and beyond. How to build airfields under fire, how to maintain supply lines across vast ocean distances, how to coordinate air, land, and sea power in relentless rhythm, how to fight in rainforests, mountains, swamps, and volcanic ridges how to break an entrenched enemy through endurance, not just firepower. It revealed the U.S. military's greatest strength, the ability to learn under pressure, and to learn fast. The Marines who fought at Guadalcanal became the instructors of a new generation. Their diaries, maps, and battlefield innovations formed the backbone of America's jungle warfare doctrine. What began as improvisation soon became science, codified in thick manuals, careful diagrams, and tactical schools. The United States had been changed forever. It became a Pacific power not through pre-war planning, but through suffering, adaptation, and survival. For the Imperial Japanese Army, Guadalcanal cast a long dark shadow across the remainder of the war. Japanese soldiers who fought there carried home the psychological scars. Fear of American night tactics, dread of American artillery coordination, the memory of starving, marching, and dying in a jungle that once seemed like an ally, the realization that America's industrial power could reach even the most remote islands. The empire had discovered the terrible irony of its situation. Its greatest strength, spiritual endurance, could not compensate for strategic overreach. Logistical collapse, famine, disease, and attrition followed Japan across the Pacific. Each battle felt heavier, more exhausting, more hopeless. The haunted phrase appeared again and again in Japanese reports. Guadalcanal was the beginning of the end. Perhaps the most profound legacy of all was the death of myth. Before Guadalcanal, both sides lived inside illusions. The Japanese believed they held perfect mastery of jungle warfare. The Americans believed they were unprepared for a fight in such terrain. The world believed Japan could not be stopped without years of retreat and recovery. Even Japanese soldiers believed that American strength came only from machines. But on Guadalcanal, under torrential rain and suffocating humidity, those illusions broke. America discovered that adaptability was its true weapon. Japan discovered that endurance alone could not defeat an industrial giant. The world discovered that the tide of the Pacific War had turned, long before the battles of 1944 made it obvious. Guadalcanal became a symbol of American tenacity. But the victory carried hidden costs. Thousands of young men were scarred in ways no metal could mend. Nightmares followed them home. Rainfall triggered memories of incoming shells. The smell of wet earth reminded them of foxholes and shallow graves. Many survivors rarely spoke of Guadalcanal, except in fragments. A veteran once said, "I left part of my soul in that jungle." I think everyone did. The irony is stark. America won because its soldiers learned to bend to the jungle. Japan lost because it refused to bend at all. In the end, victory did not belong to the side with the strongest spirit or the richest resources alone. It belonged to the side that could adapt to the world as it truly was, muddy, chaotic, and unforgiving. Even today, visitors to Guadalcanal sometimes find relics in the undergrowth. Rusted helmets, shattered rifles, unexploded mortars, dog tags half swallowed by vine, sake bottles, and canteens resting beside moss-covered foxholes. These objects are more than artifacts. They are echoes of the moment when the course of the Pacific War reversed. They are reminders that history is not written by the strongest army, but by the army that changes when it must. One image remains especially haunting. A lone Japanese helmet lying beside a riverbed, half filled with rainwater. It symbolizes the tragedy of Guadalcanal more than any victory parade ever could. It speaks of young men who came believing they could not lose. It speaks of illusions shattered by fire and rain. It speaks of a war that devoured the hopes of two great nations. And it whispers one final message. War is not won by myths but by truth. Not by pride but by adaptation. Not by the soldier who refuses to change but by the one who does. The final universal statement. What Guadalcanal teaches us today. In our modern world, filled with uncertainty, conflict, and rapid transformation, the story of Guadalcanal remains profoundly relevant. It teaches us that strength lies not in stubbornness but in flexibility. Fear can be overcome with learning and discipline. Illusions, no matter how comforting, eventually collapse. Mastery is not inherited, it is earned through trial, error, and adaptation. Even the mightiest force can fall if it clings to outdated beliefs, and sometimes the greatest victories are born in the darkest places. The Japanese forces were not terrified because the jungle betrayed them. They were terrified because they faced an enemy who changed faster than they could understand. An enemy who took the same darkness, the same mud, the same suffering, and turned it into a weapon. In the end, the story of Guadalcanal is not a story of defeat or victory alone. It is a story of transformation. Brutal, costly, and unforgettable. For in the crucible of Guadalcanal, America discovered that adaptability is the true measure of power. And the world discovered that even the most fearsome myths can fall to men who refuse to break.